that's a good question. I'll have to.
Actually, I think it means that if you're a family, you'll be surveyed for 4 months in a row.
Right, that's right. That's right. Because.
You get surveyed, and then they'll come back and survey you.
Oh.
Yes, thank you.
And then you roll in and out of that.
It's good to have experts in your session. Thank you. So timeliness, as we said, the decennial census comes out only every 10 years. So already the stuff from 2010 is starting to feel a little bit long in the tooth. The American Community Survey data gets released annually, but because it's a survey, the methods for generating estimates are dependent on having an adequate size sample, which means that they can only give data that is relevant for a given calendar year for bigger places. And for places that are smaller, they have to collect data over multiple years to get an adequate sample size to make their estimates. So every year, places that are 65,000 people or more are included in that sample. If the places are only 20,000, then the data that gets released is for data collected over 3 years. And so in a couple months, they'll release the new 3-year data set.
So is that done by region or by community?
So I have a lot more about census geography, but basically there are the same tables are offered for many different geographies, and the estimates, of course, vary. So for cities, counties that are larger than 65,000, you can get data for this year and you can compare it to data from last year. If it's smaller than 65,000, then what you can get is data for the last 3 years, and if you really want to compare it with the highest correctness, you have to compare that to a data set that is a non-overlapping 3-year period before that. So right now you can do 2010 to 2012, and you can compare that to 2007 to 2009. And so it's less precise, and especially over something like the economic downturn, which is covered several years. When the data is collected over that, it can be hard to know for sure what it means if some of the data was collected before that and some was after. And then every 5 years, every geography that the census counts for at all from block groups and up. So we'll talk more about what that means later. But block groups are, in Chicago, they are like literally several contiguous blocks. And their population is 1,000-ish people on that order. And then the current population survey data is released monthly. So they're the monthly employment numbers, the monthly poverty statistics, stuff like that. And so if you really want the most current stuff, that's what you want to use. But there are impacts on the geography. We talked a little bit about the geography for this, yes. The decennial census goes all the way down to the census block. So blocks are like the atomic unit of building up shapes that the census counts about. They are relatively recent. It wasn't until I think the 1970 census that actually all of America was divided up into blocks. They used to have sort of less precise methods. So you can get really fine-grained data, but only about what the decennial census covers, which is very fundamental counts about demographics and housing. The ACS, we talked about that, goes from block groups, which are 4 or 5 blocks and up. Question?
So the block is...
And journalists, it's hard for them to get down to the real local things that they care about with the CPS data. Your question?
And the blocks themselves are consistent over time.
Blocks are consistent over time, as far as I know, but tracts are subject to change, and block groups probably, because they don't. I don't think they want to change them, but I'm not sure about that. That's a good question.
So does that mean if someone decides to throw up a subdivision that it was once a cornfield, that's...
Yeah, so when that happens, then that census tract will probably be split. So like in Will County, that happened a lot. I can't remember. At one point, I worked it out, and there were like a lot of census tracts a lot more census tracts in Will County after the 2010 census because a lot of people have been moving out there. So that kind of thing happens.
Okay, so the county had like 4 tracts when it had like farmland, and now it's got 20.
Perhaps, yeah. That kind of thing does happen. So as a minor factoid, this is just a fun fact, the densest census tract in America is actually in Chicago. Most people would guess it's in New York, but the one densest is in Chicago. It's on Sheridan Road between like Balmoral and Catalpa. There's like 3 apartment buildings, or maybe they're condos, and so it's very small and it's very tall, so that's why it's the densest. And then also there's one in the South Loop that's way above that 4,000. It was like 15,000 people, because the South Loop is another place that's really grown recently. So in 2020, I'm sure that one tract will get split up. Okay, so the other thing that you want to consider when you're trying to pick your data is historic comparability, because in general, people want to know what changed. but that is tricky, and it's tricky at all layers. Historical census data is a bear, but there's one answer to that we'll talk about later. So the decennial census data goes back 220 years, at least for counts of people. Some of the stuff doesn't go that far back. But as we talked about, a little smaller geographies change, so there can be challenges to accurate comparability. And the nature of the questions change. Things like what race a person is something that, as you know, it's a challenge to our country in so many ways. It used to be that you picked a race and you had one. I think it was in 2000 that they started to allow people to pick more than one. So now there's 5 choices: white, black, Asian, American Indian, Native Hawaiian is separate from that, and then American Indian and Alaskan, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander for our territories and colonies that we still have, and then some other race. And you can have multiples of those, which means trying to figure out how to compare people who today have 3 or 4 races to people in 1990 who could have only had one is a question of art that I don't even know what the simple answer is. The current population survey, people love it, again, because you can do these long-term historical stuff. There's data actually back to 1948, and I think it's pretty comparable. I understand that the CPS was sort of redesigned in the mid-90s, so perhaps for some things you might be better off going back only 20 years, but 20 years of data today is pretty good. So you can get longer-term arcs for that. So I mentioned before a project called Census Reporter. What I didn't mention is I have swag. If you want pins or stickers, please take some after the session. Census Reporter is a project that I pitched to the Knight Foundation for their News Challenge program to help make census data easier for journalists. And I was very lucky that they said, sure, we'll give you some money to build that. And so we set out to build this. So the Census Reporter focuses specifically on the American Community Survey. You may have gathered, I didn't point it out as much, but the American Community Survey is the great data set for journalism specifically because it has the right combination of interesting questions, not just what color are you and how old are you, but how much money did you make, how educated are you, et cetera. And it gets down to fairly fine-grained geographies. You can actually talk about subsets of the city and compare them to each other, which you can't do at all with the CPS, and you can do with the decennial census only with the very fundamental data. So the American Community Survey is what I know the best. You caught me out on the CPS question, and I'm always trying to absorb more, but I know the ACS fairly well by now. So I'm going to show you around Census Reporter. In the book, it pitches this as like a session about tools. This is the only tool I'm really going to show a lot. I'll mention some more, but I don't know the other tools all that well. I know it turns out the internet is a little bit dubious in here, so I think that I can show you what I want to show you. We may hit some roadblocks because of access to network. So let me mirror the display so I don't go crazy. Okay, so this is Census Reporter. The URL is on all the swag, but it's censusreporter.org. And this is what the front page looks like. So we tried to make it really simple. We tried to in a lot of cases, sort of figure out ahead of time what the questions that especially journalists had, but the fact is kind of everyone has, journalists are just interested generalists, so this really works for a lot of people. To try and eliminate some of the nuances that mostly don't matter, or to sort of design it so that if you just set out, you'll probably get what you want. So we have this profile section. The idea is you pick a place, you start typing the name of a place, for example, Chicago, and it offers you some suggestions of choices, and you pick the one you want from the list. This does not search by address right now. A lot of people think it does, think it should. I actually agree that it should, but there are some technical challenges about making that happen. We have an experiment in that might come out pretty soon. But as is right now, you're meant to type the place that you want. But it could be a state too, you know. There are lots and lots of geographies, which I think we will get into later. But you pick what you want from the list, and you choose it. And to not worry about the internet, I will show my canned version in a second. The other way of getting around, this might be hard for some people. Matt, did you have a question?
Can I start typing in like a census tract number?
Yeah, but the problem is that first it's hard to know the number of the tract. This is why an address search makes sense. It's hard to know the number of a tract unless you do something else. The tract names are actually not that distinct. So how you would know to type in this specific tract, whose number might be the same as a tract in every other state, is really hard. So you know what? I think it doesn't even do that. I think we specifically said just don't show census tracts in there because it's just not going to work right. One other thing, I'll get your question. One other thing I just want to point out is we have this find places based on your current location. So if you have a phone or a computer that does geo stuff, If you click on that, it'll then show you a list of all the census geographies that contain the point where you are. So that's the easiest way to get a tract if you're in the tract you want. Question?
I guess that answers my question. Just wondering if the city is where they do it down with it.
Yeah, so the drilling down looks a little different, and I'll show you some of that as part of the tour, if the internet works. But first, let me just show the other general way you can go about this. Besides knowing the place you want, we figure sometimes people come more knowing the issue that they're concerned in, the topic. So if you want to know about, say, education, you can start typing, and we have a similar search ahead thing. And this, I hope you can see that at least a little bit, but it offers the names of the ACS tables that have data with that word in it. And here's a case where it's a little bit tricky because you kind of have to know the right words, and we have a more like a full text search project underway, but it's pretty hard. So we haven't quite figured out how to do it enough to the point where we want to show it to you. So in the worst case, you might need to go do some outside research to find the exact code for the table you want. But then if you know the code of the table you want, you can put that in here too. And maybe that's not the code. And it should show up. Or that might be a bug that we added when we updated the data this week. And then finally, this is a very gradual work in progress, but we just wanted to explain the census to people in some ways. So we've got a sort of very small beginning of some pages that try and put some of this stuff into context for you. It's written by mostly me and some of my teammates. And some of this stuff I understand more than others, so sometimes it's Spartan. One thing that it usually does will at least give you a kind of a list of all the possible tables, so it'll give you a little idea of what's in there if you don't know yet. And this is a thing that we're always going to try and make better, and if any of you are or become census experts and want to offer pages to add to this, I'll talk more later maybe about how you could possibly help build this, but that's there. So those are the three big buckets: place profiles, specific tables, and the topical help stuff. So this is what a profile page looks like. There's something like 800,000 of them or more, because basically every single geography the census counts for can get put into this template with different numbers, different maps, but the same basic model. The idea with this is that we wanted to talk to journalists. We tried to figure out what the main things that people want to know about when they come to this data are, and just put them all in one place. So you just have it right there. So at the top we have the big numbers. This isn't actually drilling down, it's drilling up, but it tells you about the places that it's contained in. So you can easily go from Chicago to the two counties that it's in. Some people don't realize that there's a tiny little fraction of Chicago in DuPage County up by O'Hare. There's like maybe 100 people who live there or something like that. The metro area, the state, and so on. You get these numbers, and then as you scroll down, we have bands of the site for each of the major topics. So there's demographics, economics, social characteristics, etc. And we have big numbers where it makes sense. We pack more data in by showing it as a chart, and you can look at this and learn the fact that you want. As you can see most clearly here, for every statistic we try and have comparable numbers to places that are nearby, because a number is meaningless out of context. So Chicago's median age is about 33, which is a little less than the median age of the metro area, and a little less than the median age for the state of Illinois. So we have those numbers. For the charts, you have to hover over them to get the comparable data, but it is there, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to know the details for the charts, there's a button near each of them called Show the Data, which gives you the actual numbers, and you can copy and paste this into a spreadsheet, but there's also other ways to get the data into spreadsheets. And also, and I encourage you to use this because it's the best promotion that we can get, you can embed our charts on your website just by clicking on the little button. If you just copy this, it's an iframe, and you put it on your website, and hopefully you're going. And a couple of times people have done that, we've gotten nice bumps in our traffic on the website because it's an ad for us. It's very, we have to change this to show the chart, but it's really modest. It's not like covered with our brand, but it does have a little logo on there, and it offers people the chance to come see this whole page. So I'll leave it to you to kind of get into the details. I'll point out one thing. We have sort of a warning. So this dagger here refers to the margin of error, which is referring to these numbers here. You can see. So do people generally understand the idea of margin of error? Should I take a second on that? Yeah. Basically, when you do an estimate, you may be wrong. And so the margin of error is, when people say a survey is plus or minus 3%, that's the margin of error. So for any estimate in the census data, they tell you kind of the edges that it could be. And in certain cases, when there just aren't enough of a certain kind of people for there to be an accurate estimate, there's a high margin of error. And so we flag those. We just kind of came up with a benchmark that says if the margin of error is 10%, then what that really means is like a 20% range of the answer. You should be careful with that. And for journalists, it's just kind of, you can just be less precise about how you talk about the number. But if you're like trying to cite something as this has the most or the least based on something, actually with any margin of error, but especially like that, you're walking on thin ice. So this stuff goes on and on and on and on, and hopefully it's interesting. We have a little hope to make like topical subpages of these. I have a student who wants to do some of this kind of work, who might make like a demographics page that has more than just the few things. It goes really deep into, and more on economics. So that may come, but basically this is what you have. You can also navigate the map if you want to go to nearby places. You can click on that. The other thing you can do is you can view all of the data that these come from. Let's see if this works. Looks like it is. Okay. So this is the table view, and this is also where you end up going in the other direction. So this is the census like produces specific tables that are cross tabulations of all this stuff because they can't release each individual response. That would violate people's privacy. So it gets complicated because they have to figure out which factors people want to connect, like sex by age, and then run the tables for that. And if you want something else by something other else, there's actually a tricky way to do that, but it gets into the special case. Did you have a question?
Yeah, when you were saying about smaller, does it go to Chicago community areas?
So we could talk about that. The Census Bureau doesn't tabulate data for Chicago community areas, but it's a question I'm very interested in. And so I've got a sort of a side project. This isn't my day job either, but and so I've run ACS data for the community areas. I still haven't quite figured out how to handle median age and other median values as opposed to counts, but I can give you a link to where you can download any of these tables aggregated up to the community area. But the census goes, the closest you can get to that with actual official census geographies are what are called PUMAs, which there are 19 in Chicago. And they do align with community areas, so every community area is in exactly one PUMA, but only Englewood is a PUMA unto itself. No, Austin. Austin is the biggest community area, and so Austin is a PUMA unto itself. Otherwise, there's 2 or 3 community areas in each one, and that may not really have the precision that you're looking for when you're talking. So here's where some of that drilling down comes in. Over here on the side, we have a couple of ways to kind of go from this to related stuff. So you can add more places. So a place is a census term. Basically, it means a city. We might talk more about that later, depending on how time goes. So you can say add all the other cities and towns in Cook County or DuPage or any of these. If you add all the places in the United States, it's probably going to break. Some of the stuff that you can do but shouldn't, we haven't figured out how we want the experience to go to say, sorry, you can't. So we leave it in there, and it might just not work. You can also divide Chicago down into census tracts, block groups, and zip codes. So if you click on one of these, it replaces this table with all the zip codes in Chicago, which actually are not necessarily contained in Chicago. Some of them overlap, and even census tracts technically can overlap the city boundary, and we just don't worry about that. We give you the whole tract, so some of that might be in DuPage County or in Norwood or something like that. But so these are some ways to navigate around and kind of get more precise with the data you want. Okay, so one of the other things you can do with these table views is you can look at them in a couple of different forms. So I preloaded those, although they were, here we go, here's one. You can get it in a map, which looks better when it's not on such a tight screen. So this is all the census tracts in Chicago for sex by age by educational attainment. And so this is saying, and maps are really hard to do automatically. Like when you see maps in the paper, it's because somebody did some pretty sophisticated work, even the simplest stuff, to make it really right. So our being able to automatically generate a map for all of the different census tables, some of them work better than others. I actually probably picked a bad example here because this statistic here is basically all the men, period. So those darker ones are just places where there are more men, but then you can pick here and say, okay, I want to say how many men have graduate degrees, and it'll redraw it. And so there's only a few places in the city that have a high percentage, and then even some of those are only this. And so one of the things is you don't really want just men, you want people, probably. But the Census Bureau has this stuff as kind of very fine-grained. And so normally what you'd do is you'd download the data, and you'd add up the men in a certain case and the women in a certain case, and then you'd go. I've got some ideas about how we might be able to make that easier for people here, but we haven't figured out quite how to put that into play. But we put it in there because sometimes with certain data, you can get some insight from that, and we wanted to offer that. The other one we have is what we call the distribution chart. And so this just kind of shows you where everybody falls on the line. So you can, if you want to know, the zeros are usually places that are like water or a park sometimes. But this tells you this census tract is particularly low in this statistic, which is, I think this is again one of those totaling ones. So there are like 1,400 tables, so a lot of this stuff, we just couldn't like give each table personal attention to figure out the best way to tune these to them. Over time, maybe we'll get a little bit better. But still, sometimes you can kind of figure out, you know, where the outliers are and what the outlying values are, and that can be valuable.
So Joe, a question about that.
Yeah.
So this is, first off, this is amazing. Like,
Thank you.
I say that at least 3 or 4 times during the session. And I'll say it before I ask any questions. I've got all these different views of the data, and it's allowing people to explore census in a way that they haven't before. If in that last chart, for example, I discovered something that I think is really novel and interesting. But I don't have I'm not a reporter, so I don't really have a publication platform other than maybe Twitter. Does Census Reporter have some way of flagging interestingness?
No, that's actually an interesting idea. I hadn't really thought about that. No, not really. We do have, you can't quite see it here, but we do have on every page a little feedback button, and I encourage you to use it, whether you find something that's broken or you're just like, oh, what if this? You can at least tell us. We can't promise to do anything about it, especially because we spent all the grant money now and I haven't figured out who's going to give us more yet. But we want to hear anyway, because we do want to keep it going on there's a lot of really good resources that are predominantly built by volunteers. I think we got the new data in even though nobody got paid to do it. So I think we can keep doing that. But that's a good question.
Or a donate button then?
So we could, that's not a bad idea. So this page I just had up to show you the last topical stuff. We looked at that a little bit anyway, but you can go and read my deathless prose about whatever I was able to figure out about some of these different sections of. One that is a little bit hard fought and is good is we kind of figured out a little bit about what you can use to talk about same-sex couples from census data. So obviously the Census Bureau doesn't ask people if they're gay or not, but they do ask people if they are partnered with the person that they live with and if that person is the same sex or not. And so it used to be that if you said that you lived with someone who was the same sex as you and you were married or even a partner with them, because the Census Bureau does track unmarried partnerships, they would consider that an error and they'd correct the gender of one of or the sex of one of the people. They've gotten over that and they figured that out now. So now they the only thing that they do, and this is still tricky because if you say that you're married to someone in only a few states, is that legitimately possible? And so it's kind of an evolving thing. And so we put down what we knew about that. It's actually changing still, so we'll try and keep it up. So let me get back to the slide deck a little bit, but I will say that we are getting close to the end of the the part I really wanted to get to. I have a bunch of stuff about census geography if you really want to delve into how the maps are drawn and what the different kinds of shapes mean. And I have a little bit about some other stuff, but it's getting close to the time where you should really feel free to interrupt me and get into your questions. But I do have some slides in case you're shy or just want me to go on and on and on. So there are some other tools that you should know about. I put together a bundle of links in Bitly, and then I forgot to put the URL anywhere, so I'll tweet that or something. We'll get it around. Maybe we can get it in the notes for this session too. So there's one called census.ire.org, which is kind of the spiritual ancestor to Census Reporter. That was a project that I worked on and that kind of inspired me to say maybe with money we could do more. So IRE is Investigative Reporters and Editors. They're a professional organization for journalists. And they convened some of us to do a project for the decennial census when it came out. And that's what this is. So if you do need to use decennial census data for some reason, this may help you. It only does some of the geographies, census tract, county subdivision, place, county, and state. But you can more easily than from the Census Bureau just get all of the states in the country or all of the tracts in Illinois for a specific table and go do stuff with that. So we might get to look at that in a minute if we want to, but I won't show it just yet.
In the example you were showing us, it was the Chicago area, but this tool works all over?
Yeah, we try and just basically take all the data and pump it through this. So the American Community Survey covers the 50 states, Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico. There's some kind of wrinkles with Puerto Rico because in some ways it's part of the United States, in other ways it's just not. It doesn't cover the island areas, as they call them, the Virgin Islands and Guam and Marianas. But yeah, it covers the whole United States. So American Fact Finder is the Census Bureau's tool that works sort of like Census Reporter. People sometimes harsh on it because it's a little bit hard to use, but they have to do so much more than Census Reporter. So I have a lot of sympathy for them because we're just like, just the American Community Survey, just the current American, because nobody asked, but we don't have historical American Community Survey data in Census Reporter because there are reasons why it's complicated to do comparison over time. We just had to skip that so far, and we haven't yet figured out what to do about it. The American Fact Finder has all the stuff. And remember that big long list of products that I showed you at the beginning? It has stuff for most of those too, the CPS, et cetera. So it is sometimes maligned. It is not the world's best website, but you can get a lot of stuff out of it. You shouldn't just blow it off. IPUMS and NHGIS.org, these both come from the University of Minnesota, who are a partner with the census. The PUM in this stuff is for public use microdata. And that's an interesting way that if you have a little more facility with data manipulation, you can basically build your own statistical tables. So I was talking about how you have to rely on the Census Bureau to give you the cross tables that you want, but the PUMS data is presented in a way with certain sort of statistical weights, so you can aggregate it to get at fairly fine-grained questions. My favorite story, a reporter from the New York Times named Rob Geveloff knew that there's a sort of a trope about the Italian barbers of New Jersey. And he wanted to know whether or not there were less Italian barbers in Jersey than there used to be. And he was able to basically cook up a PUMS table that it wasn't down to the town level, but at, I think the state or maybe even the county level, he was able to get some idea of the trend in people of Italian heritage who are barbers. And so that kind of thing is possible. And what IPUMS does not only makes that data a little easier to get at than the Census Bureau does, but also deals with some of the comparison over time stuff and the harmonization of different questions. So if geographies change or if certain details change, their site is meant to make it easier to build up these long-term kinds of comparisons, not even just Italian barbers. Like you could just say, I want to know about education level, and they'll still deal with the fact that, say, census tracts get redrawn, and they'll be able to give it to you in consistent stuff. The NHGIS, the G stands for GIS is a Geographical Information System, and it's a related project that basically tries to harmonize the changes in the maps over time so you can deal with that data more effectively. These tools are both fairly complicated to use, but they pay off if you need that stuff. And I have some tips about how you can learn some more about them later. Social Explorer is a commercial site, and in some ways I think it's trying to do what Census Reporter does, but they're trying to make money at it. It's a good site. We get it for free at Northwestern. I tried to look. I don't think you can get it from the Chicago Public Library. If you guys don't know, you can get incredible online databases just by putting in your library card, but I don't think Social Explorer is one of them. But if you have access to a university library or research organization, it may be another easier way to get through some of this data. And this last one here, I don't know a whole lot about, but it's called Data Ferret, and Data Ferret has got all kinds of census data, mostly the CPS and some of the other things, not so much the ACS, and it provides sort of an interactive tool to put together your query and get data out of it. And that's about all I can say about that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, if I wanted to find some data using my library card, do I have to go to the library site and then?
Well, yeah, for the ones, there are some that if you go to the library site and you put in your library card number and your zip code, and I think now they have passwords, but you can get in the first time with just your card number and your zip code, then you could basically go through the site to get to some of the licensed data resources that they have. Things like magazine archives and things like that. I can't remember what all, but there's some good stuff.
So
But not census data, as far as I know.
So if I was writing an article for your class, I could use that.
I think so. It's worth checking out. That's all I really can say about it, because actually my library card's expired. I feel terrible about it, because I used to work in my town library when I was in high school. Anyway,
Does Census Reporter have an API?
it does. So I don't know how many people know what an API is, Application Programming Interface. It's basically a way for you to write your own program to deal with the same data that we use to make our pages. And in fact, we built our pages that you can see by talking to our own API. So I won't get into it too much more, but it is possible for you to write an application that pulls our data. In general, there's only sometimes when that's the right thing to do, but if it is the right thing to do, we encourage you to. And I'll talk to anybody who wants to more about that either now or at any future time, because we would love for people to use it. The other thing, which actually I should have gotten into and I didn't, is you can export data from. What did it do?
Well, there's also the census has their own API too, right?
Yes, the Census Bureau does have an API, and it I think it's pretty usable for certain things. The main thing with that kind of stuff is if you kind of want to have all the data to do a bunch of different things with it, then using the API is inefficient because you have to ask it a lot of small questions, and instead you should just get all the data and deal with it at once. But if you want to have like a web page that just like, if anybody lands on any one of these pages, we'll just grab the population for that place, and you don't want to do it all ahead of time because most of the places people won't even ever see, then APIs are effective ways to do that.
So there is a way to sort of get the entire sort of body of data.
Yes, you can get giant bulk tables from the Census Bureau, and in fact, if that's a headache for you to deal with, Census Reporter, the way it's built on top of a SQL database, and we actually dump our data files. So if you know how to use SQL and you think that that's an easier way to sort of slice and dice the data, you can just import our dumps into Postgres, and I can talk about that more before I glaze over everybody's eyes, but that's a thing that we do. And also you can just export, so over here on our table pages, you have an option to download data as a CSV file or an Excel file, or as 3 different kinds of GIS data. If you know about making maps, or if you want to even dip your toe in it, you can get this stuff, and so you can get the data to make maps like ours, but it'll also be something where you can do some of the processing that we didn't know for sure which kind people would want to do. So that's possible, so I want to make sure you know. One thing I should warn you about, if you get the Excel download and you double click it and open it, it's going to warn you that there's something wrong with it. And I think I have one open here. We got to figure out what that bug is, but it's not actually a problem. It looks scary, but it's not that big of a deal. But what it amounts to is, did I close it? I think it just amounts to, yeah, so it gives you this warning, but you just say, I don't care. And I think it's just that all the zeros are 0 dot lots of zeros, but they're still zeros. But we'll try and fix that as soon as we can. Like I said, nobody's getting paid anymore, so it's a little harder. So actually, before I put this in full screen, one thing I want to make sure to talk about before we run out of time, although it's not, we have till 3? Yeah. Sorry, okay, it's not so bad. We can go back and get into geography in more detail, or we can just do question time, and that's fine too. But this is a pretty cool resource. So in the wake of the release of the 2010 census, a professor at Arizona State, the Crockett School of Journalism at Arizona State, gathered together a bunch of people to teach about census data. And I was actually invited to go be part of that, which just sort of surprised me because I was still pretty new at this stuff. But you can watch me talk about census geography. I think there's 17 talks. And each of them are like 30 to 40 minutes videoed, high quality video, like the journalism school students really knew what they were doing, and they made really nice videos of the talks. You can download the slides. So for a lot of these topics, like this is a nice quick way to just figure out a lot more. So decennial census and American Community Survey, some of this is oriented towards journalists, like half of us were journalists and half were people from the Census Bureau. It also goes, like here's, you can learn about that data ferret tool I was telling you about. That's what I would do, because I should have watched it beforehand, so I could have acted like I knew more about it. The CPS, current population survey, and SIP, there's one too many P's here, but this is actually not to do with the census at all, but if you want to know about data that's available about jails and prisons, here's a 35-minute talk about that. All kinds of stuff, including like foreign trade, the census of governments. If you want to understand about how to verify the fact that Illinois has more actual government bodies than any other state in America, which is a true fact, you can learn about the survey of governments. So if you go to this page, there's links to all these videos, and they're pretty great. So I wanted to make sure to expose everybody to that. Otherwise, in the slides, how many people want me to just go on and on about geography, and how many people want to just like shoot questions around and see what we're seeing?
I actually have a question. So Chicago population dropped sort of dramatically in 2010. And
Yes.
probably wasn't because 100 million people moved out of Chicago in 1 year. So So is that a matter of like the ACS and then we do the decennial and then?
If you want to look at the change in Chicago's population, you can go, the ACS goes back to 2005, and Chicago is big enough that there's annual data. So you could look at the annual trend from 2005 to 2010 and see how it went. It's a combination of people moving out and different birth rates, but and I think death rates. But yeah, so you could use the CPS or the ACS to get a little closer look at the steps in which that process happened. Is that kidding?
No, I guess my question is, like, what explains sort of that dramatic jump? I mean, my sense is it's a matter of like the counting. One is a survey, one is. That can't be true. Like,
No, I think it's more to do with the reality that the cost of living in Chicago has gone up. In general, the Midwest is losing people. All the major, like if you look at the metro areas, the only metro areas in America that are declining in population are Rust Belt metro areas, and it's just the fact that the bottom fell out of our main economic, manufacturing stuff. So the combination of people moving to nearby suburbs, and I haven't compared Chicago to the suburbs, but we know that there's a migration trend, especially of people who just can't afford living in the city anymore, out to the suburban areas. So there's a combination of factors, but ultimately the interpretation is contentious. There's different people are going to have different theories, and there's no one place in the census where I think you're going to get exactly the answer. So I guess I can't say too much more about it.
On a related topic, I too, someone that just recently is doing real estate in the suburbs, and she's saying that Chicago is the millennials are going to be moving to Chicago in droves, which doesn't really surprise me because I just do my own personal survey because I live in the city.
Mm-hmm.
But they're basing it on housing information.
Mm-hmm.
My question is my theory is they only stay for like 5 years till they get married and have kids, and then they go back out again. And then when everybody's decided to live at home with their parents because they're broke,
Yeah.
and have student debt. So I'm wondering how accurate that demographic is going to be or stay and for how long.
How accurate you mean? Is that a correct prediction, or are we able to count that correctly? That's a good question, and most of that is sort of the kind of stuff that people use census data to justify their hypotheses about, but the answer isn't simply in there. You can get data about the age of people and the age of people living in households, so you can use the census to sort of quantify how many young people are still living at home. With the decennial census, there are tables for the census tract and higher that have how many people of each actual age, like integer, like 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds. And it can be interesting to chart that, because what you see in Chicago specifically is this big drop when school starts. So there are a lot more 4-year-olds in Chicago than there are 6-year-olds. Most likely because people move out of the city to get their kids into better schools. I don't know for sure, but you can see a pronounced drop in there, and that's interesting. With the census, with the ACS data, it's not as fine-grained, but you might be able to use the trend over multiple releases to get at that, although again, inside the city, you can't really compare that much. At the very small levels, we talked about the 5-year ACS, so at census tract level and so on, that's only in the 5-year ACS, and if you want to compare that to an earlier data release, there are not yet 2 adjacent 5-year surveys because the program isn't old enough. Next year will be the first time that we have 2 that you can compare. Now, some people just compare overlapping surveys and just either sort of wave their hand or sort of make sure to not.
What's confusing to me is all the other people, like architects and environmental people, they say that everybody in the next 20 years are going to be moving to cities because it's economically better because they can use resources better and there's more resources available to them. But then I always wonder, well, if they can't afford to live in the city.
Well, I think that the trend to urbanization is kind of indisputable. Now here we're getting into sort of opinion or whatever, not based on specific on census. But the other thing is that there's a trend towards more smaller cities and places that you might not even think of as a city per se, but that are essentially city scope, that are in the orbit of bigger cities, because you get those combinations of sort of resource efficiency, but they're not the big city where everyone wants to move, and so. There's a couple different ways you can interpret that, but people aren't moving to the countryside.
Right.
They're just moving to smaller
That's
cities.
like the rural area,
Yeah.
but they're going to the outer reaches of like
Yeah, I think that's true. I haven't looked lately, but
But I mean, because it's next, Rockford is close to DeKalb, but Rockford, we know, died off. So
yeah. So everyone, you can tell now why I think census data is so interesting, because you can like think about all these things and you can sort of get something to substantiate it with. Of course, it takes some practice and some learning to know how to go around that.
No, I'm just trying
But
to
it's-
understand what they mean by what they're telling me and what they're basing it on.
Well, so a different thing, we can't talk about this too much here, but a different thing that I'm really interested in is how journalists can do a better job of substantiating their data-oriented stories by publishing the data that goes with the story instead of just leaving you to believe that they have it. But that's a different topic, but I'm working on that question. David, you had
Yeah, actually NPR did a piece that used some census data, and Joe's colleague on Census Reporter, Ryan Pitts, called me up like 2 hours later and he's like, "You made a mistake with the ACS data," because we had published the data that we used. So that's kind of that goes to Joe's point. That was what I was going to ask though. I had 2 questions. So one question is, when using the ACS estimates, what's the right way to talk about the range of the estimates? So, and really like think about it. So is this sort of the 5-year, when we're saying it's a 5-year ACS estimate, this is sort of the 5-year average?
So,
Is this
I don't know if-
estimated for today, like, for the end of the 5-year period?
It's not really precise to call it an average, and Paul Overberg told me why, but I can't quite recite his words. Paul is a journalist at the USA Today who's one of the like grand sages of this stuff, and David knows him from the journalism world. But it's not technically an average. It's just the method of the survey was to collect data over 5 years instead of 1 year, and that is the input to the estimate process. I think most often the audience that cares about that precision doesn't need it explained, they just need it noted. And the audience that doesn't care that much would just be thrown off by getting into it too much. So I think it's a matter of sort of artfully making sure not to make statements that aren't actually defensible with the data, especially again, like not making ranked lists and saying that something is definitively the first, especially if the second one, if you go to the top of its error bar, is above the bottom of the first one's error bar. So you have to be careful about things like that. But a lot of times, especially in journalism, it reads better anyway to be less precise. And so capitalize on that. Now, when you're making charts, it's a different question because charts imply a certain degree of precision. Like our maps, one of the things this is a question I still don't have resolved. Our maps put things into buckets. These are the top 80 to 100, these are 60 to 80. But some of them, if you go take the error bars into account, would cross into the next bucket. And I don't even know what we should do about that. When you make like a bar chart or a dot chart, you can actually put what they call error bars on there and show it, and sometimes that's good. But again, sometimes your audience is just gonna it's gonna be clutter and they won't even know what to make of it. So you have to kind of just be careful. There were a bunch of questions over, but your hand's up now, so.
Yeah, so this is actually not a question so much as a connection between those 2 comments. On the population question, if you ask the census, their official reference for population is the Population Estimates Program, which is not necessarily a derivative of the American Community Survey, and that is trying to estimate on July 1st of any given year what the true population of any place. I think they do it above 65,000 or at similar geographies, and they're not doing that so much based on survey methodology, but a benchmark from each decennial census taking into account births and deaths, migration. So in those cases, if you look at 2010 versus 2000, there's probably a methodological gap there when you look at 2010 catching up. And why for some indicators, even the ACS probably isn't the best reference for something like population, because you can't say over a 3-year period population was X, because it could at any time in those periods vary dramatically. So
Yeah.
I think
That gets at a really key question I have, which is which one to use. Because like at NPR they say use the ACS. That's
So if you're talking about, if you can get away with just the population, then you should use the estimates because they are better references, but they only talk about down to, I think, like cities, places, and counties. So sometimes that's useful, sometimes not. But if you want to talk about the some ACS figure as a percentage of a population, of course you should use the population from that same ACS release because it's the best thing you have. And then again, the main thing is statistical methods are never precise, and it's important to not give them too much as if they are.
I have another question that popped into my head. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, you said before, was part of one of your
The current population survey? Yes.
Right. How, I get frustrated by everybody who knows, I was a little late to the train, but that when the only thing they can estimate job loss or gain is on how many people apply for benefits. Now, when you look at, does the Bureau of Labor Statistics take into any account any information of people that no longer are eligible for benefits? How do we track that?
I think that's what's called a discouraged worker. Other people here may know better than I do, and I don't think that's in the BLS, but I think that there's a program called the SIP, the Survey of Income and Program Participation, which I think uses that term specifically. Actually, no, maybe discouraged worker was up on the screen. Those are fine points that I'm not that expert in, but that's part of why there are so many different programs, because the fact is sometimes that matters, but you just can't get at that with every method, and so people sometimes just don't understand why it's proliferated so much. But there are certain times when they have to get at that answer, and so there are some programs that make sure to be able to answer that efficiently, and other ones where adding that in would just make it impossible for them to do what they're trying to do. So.
Well, I get why they don't do it, but my point is, how.
Where is that number?
When they say it's like 7% in certain community and 10% in other unemployment in other communities, I'm like thinking, that's the counted head. What do we multiply it by to get the actual?
Well, I mean, you have similar questions about counting people who are homeless when you're counting about population, or people who are undocumented who are avoiding being counted. So I mean, there's all kinds of. Anytime you set out to count stuff, there are gaps, and that's why the more precise you need to be, the more you need to really understand the methodology and consider the fine points. But I think it's also the case that a little bit of awareness of how to be responsible may not absolve you per se, but you can do a lot with this stuff just by saying, okay, here's some responsible guidelines without having to wait till you are an expert or being able to find an expert. And that's, I want to encourage in general people to sort of feel like this stuff is something that with a little bit of energy they can actually get some answers from. I think there are other questions in here.
A very minute question. You said you could get the zip codes from the Census Reporter. Are your zip codes the same as the census zip code tabulation?
Yes. So that's the weird wrinkle, but zip codes are not geographies. The Postal Service does not draw a map and say this is a zip code, because some zip codes are buildings and some zip codes are conceptual. Like Northwestern University has its own zip code that in some places overlays the Evanston zip code that would otherwise be delivered, because all the mail goes to the university and then they take it to a university building that's next door to a residential building. So zip codes are not geographies on a map, but zip code tabulation areas are basically the Census Bureau's response to the fact that people think that they are geographies on a map and they want them to be. So ZCTA, we call them zip codes on here, but it is the same ZCTA. And what that means is the Census Bureau's best mapping of zip codes that can be put on a map. So some zip codes that if you like have a mailing list, there will be zip codes that are not ZCTAs for that very thing that I just described. But it can be useful anyway, and so people just sort of wave their hands and make do.
So if you're interested within the city of Chicago, you can't necessarily link the zip code to a place in the city.
Well, technically, you can say, here's an address or a latitude and longitude. What zip code is it in? And that's, in a sense, that's straightforward. And we use that kind of a method to say these are the zip codes which are in Chicago or overlap it a little bit. And you can get pretty far with that if you don't have to be so precise. And people know what zip codes are, so it's a lot easier. Zip codes are not necessarily, they're bigger usually than census tracts, but they're still inside the city, so you get some sense of more neighborhood factors, and so they can be a more satisfying way to get a number that's relevant to this place and not one that's 2 miles across town.
What's the best way to get historical census data?
Probably the IPMS project, and one of those videos I talked about is from this woman named Katie Genadek, who's at IPMS, and she can talk about that. There's also one of the things we're doing with our marketing budget is for Census Reporter is we're sponsoring articles that are being written for a website called Source from the Open News Project. Dan Sinker's actually in another room right now talking, and it's his project. But Source is the sort of online journal for journalism and technology, and we basically said we would like people to understand the census better. And Rob, who's the guy who did the Italian barber thing, just recently wrote an article about how to use IPMS for us. And that's not so much about the historical stuff, but that site also does get into the history. And I think Katie's video which is on the Cronkite site, does get a little bit more into the historic stuff.
Like if
But-
you wanted to get data from 1970, is
Yeah,
that possible?
it's hard. I mean, it gets tricky, especially because even city boundaries, cities annex neighboring cities and stuff like that. And so whether you mean the city as it is today or the city as it was legally defined at that time, this fact finder I think only goes back to the 1990 decennial census, maybe not even. It may only go back to 2000. So it gets hard. A lot of times that's when you just find an academic who's your friend and ask them to do it for you. Which is, there's no shame in that. It's okay. There's actually, I can't remember what it's called now. I can look it up. At Northern Illinois University, there's an organization. So first, the Census Bureau has these things called state data centers, and their job is basically to help citizens of the state use census data, and that's everybody. Like, you don't have to be some hoity-toity person. Like, they'll take your call. And this group at Northern Illinois helped me with some stuff when I was at the Tribune that I didn't, either to clarify things or to actually, they can run reports for you sometimes. So if you look up like Illinois State Data Center, you'll find a list of places, and some of them will really just take your call and may be able to run the report for you.
You can get a database through the Urban Institute from 1970 on that adjusts for changes in census tract boundaries.
That's awesome. Yeah,
They've been updating that.
that's true. That's one of the things that they do is as part of the NNIP stuff they were talking about this morning is they deal with some of that stuff for us. More questions? So we got like 10 more minutes. I could talk a little bit about geography, or we could just wait until David has a question. So
Oh,
it's all tech.
kind of a newbie question, but what are good sources for mortality and birth rate statistics?
I would guess the CDC, but I don't know that for sure. And if you think Fact Finder is a drag, the CDC's website is called Wonder. I wonder how it got to be that way. I was curious about drug mortality rates when Philip Seymour Hoffman overdosed. I was like, so how many people do this? I just wanted to get some numbers. And I found them. I think I found them in CDC site. And then I tried 2 months later to find them again. I couldn't. But that's not my specialty, so I don't know.
So there's no Census Bureau products that cover that.
No. I mean, there's one table in the ACS about women who gave birth in the last year.
Yeah.
But I don't think it even tells you how many births they gave, which, I mean, multiple births is probably a pretty small percentage, right? So you could probably kind of, for a given place, say if this many women gave birth this year, then there are about this many, but not deaths. There's no specific death count.
Kind of a newbie one, do they have any focus on disabilities?
Yes, there are questions in the ACS about disability, and I can't remember what the specific sort of factors are, but it has to do with definitely blindness and I think maybe deafness and mobility and maybe cognitive. I'm not sure, but there are like there's. I'm sorry.
Does it like break it down by? I mean, I'll do this research.
It doesn't get very specific.
Okay.
No, because that's the kind of thing where there just aren't enough people to roll it up without either divulging people's personal information. Oh, there's one person in Chicago or one person in this census tract. I know who that must be. So it's pretty coarse. Sure.
You mentioned this briefly about the tool not comparing different accretions of the ACS. Is that something that you would be interested in doing?
You mean like being able to compare the 2007 population of Chicago to the 2013?
Or like comparing even the 2013 one year to the 2012 one year?
Yeah, we are generally interested in that. If we had funding, we might be able to do it. What we thought about basically with that is for the biggest places, so the ones in the 1 year probably, we could just take the oldest ACS and the current ACS. Because the other thing is we don't want to clutter the site. Like we want it to be the right balance between complete and clear. And so the year-by-year change in most statistics for most places probably isn't that great. But we figured if we took the earliest ACS and the current ACS and showed just the change in those two figures for certain statistics, we might be able to get away with it. So, and the amount of actual data to manage for the 1 year stuff is not that many. But only like, I think it's 25% of counties in the United States are big enough to be in the 1 year release, 65,000 people or more, and only like 40% are big enough to be in the 3 year release, 20,000 or more. So 60% of the counties in America are less than 20,000 people. You see these maps of the country colored in by county, and they're just telling you about big open spaces. And so it can be very misleading to see this map and see a color for something, it looks bigger because it's actually not very populated. The populated places are smaller. So always be skeptical when you see maps of counties for that reason, because a lot of those counties, especially in the middle of America, are very thinly populated.
The other question I have, and I don't know where to find this information, is a lot of things now are looking at environmental impact studies, and the only reason it would relate to census would be is how does it affect the people, the population in that environment?
Yeah, so in that case, you'd need to figure out what granularity that environmental data is available, and then how to map it into census data, and that's not as hard as you might think, but it's not beginner's stuff. To be able to compare, especially the biggest problem is that a lot of times the way that the geographies are described in one data set are not easy to link up to the way the census describes the geographies. They'll be, state names, there's only 50 states, so even if they have the name spelled out here and a code here, you can just sort that out. But even when you get down to counties, and counties are pretty standard, so they probably use what's called a FIPS code, which is a pretty standard identifier for the county. But if you're getting like within a city or a metro area, it may be harder to say these are places that are problems, because that kind of stuff, they usually kind of pinpoint it. Here is a place where there is a problem. They don't say, this tract has this percentage of problem and that tract has that. So it's tricky business. It's probably time to look for a mentor, a data Sherpa guru thing.
And I won't find any crime data in the census.
No, crime data, comparing crime data across places is hard because there's just different methodologies for counting stuff and different motivations for accuracy, if we can be honest. So yeah, the census doesn't get into that.
Do you know any sources for labor statistics other than BLS stuff?
That's not something I know a lot about. I think there's a lot in BLS, even beyond the CPS, but I don't know. Oh, one thing that there's a video about in that video series that I thought was awesome when I saw it, but I haven't really had any reason to use it. There's a program, Matt left, Matt knows a little about this too. There's a program like local economic, LEHD, maybe someone else knows about this. Do you know about it?
Employment household dynamics?
Right. So it gets into some interesting local details about like commuting and like where people, in the sense, actually the ACS has a lot of stuff about not only where you live, but where you work, and whether, how far, not exactly how far you go, stuff about like how long your commute is. But the LEHD stuff, there's a really cool tool that Paul Overberg demonstrates in one of those videos that he showed how to get some really interesting stuff about. It was more about employment dynamics than like specific, like it's in the name, like where people, like flows of population and working population, but I can't say too much smart about it. So we're just about to time, so it's your last call. Any questions? Well, don't all bump over each other, but please come up and take some swag. Thank you for your interest. And I'm serious though about, so the other thing I wanted to mention very briefly is I feel like with all the stuff we're doing here all weekend, like the most important thing is who can help me later. And so it's really important to remember the internet is beautiful at connecting human beings to each other, and it's a good way to realize that you're not alone even if you feel like you're alone. So I pointed out the feedback section on our site, and you can ask questions there. We probably don't know the answer, but we might be able to help you, especially if it's about how our site works, but even if it's about ACS data in general, you can try us. Opendata.stackexchange.com is a website that's just like people asking and answering questions about open data. There's a section on census, and I try and watch that, and I like to answer those questions when I can, or even when I can't, I like to try and take that as an excuse to learn something about it. So that's a place you can go. The Census Bureau themselves run this thing, it's a crazy website, acsdatacommunity.leveragesoftware.com. It's another kind of discussion forum where people can talk about census questions. It's pretty slow traffic, but every once in a while questions come up. You might throw something out there and get an answer. And then I put the NNIP people down here. I actually don't know that much about the exact services they offer. I didn't even realize that Catherine Pettit was going to be here this morning. But they're another resource in general, although they don't have a Chicago partner anymore. So I don't know how much that helps you. But reach out, connect with each other, learn who here is going to be your census buddy as you learn through this stuff, and get their email address, and come to OpenGov Hack Nights at 1871 on Tuesdays and look for people who can help you and things like that. But you're not alone. All right, thanks. Come get your swag, please. One of those is going to look great on your camera staff. So.
I think so. Oh, go ahead, put your hand in there, then I'll have something else, but then be slow with it, please. Okay, slower, slower, slower. Thank you.
You're very discriminating. The square ones are collector's items.
I see that. I wanna grab one of those.
Who else can put their hand in there? Got it.
No one will know.
Take one.
Confidentiality.
Take. Oh, I didn't even get that. This, yeah, one's a sticker, one's a. That was interesting.
Thank you.
I definitely want to check out the IPMS thing.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's really, the interface is really complicated.
Yeah.
I would love to give the census report treatment to IPMS, but first I would have to learn a lot about words,
Yeah.
and then I'd have to get the resources to do it. But I know that people make it do really cool stuff once they sort of, so if you're patient.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know.